The morning that changed everything. Terrence Jackson woke up to a typical morning in his modest, sunlit home. His coffee steamed in his favorite mug as he looked out the window at the city he had sworn to serve and protect. It was his routine, a moment of peace before stepping into the chaos of public service. Only a month into his term as the first black mayor of his city, Terrence had quickly learned the weight of the office. Every decision he made reverberated across his city, still grappling with its troubled past. That morning, he dressed casually in a crisp white shirt and jeans. Despite his new title, Terrence believed in staying connected to the people. He loved walking the streets, meeting residents, and experiencing the city as they did. Today, he planned to visit a local bakery on Pine Street, a family-run establishment known for its warm croissants and even warmer smiles. As he walked down the block, people waved, calling out, "Morning, Mr. Mayor." He returned their greetings with an easy smile, stopping occasionally to chat. He thrived on these interactions. They reminded him why he had fought so hard to win the mayoral seat, why he had endured years of grassroots campaigning, sleepless nights, and relentless opposition. This city needed hope, and Terrence was determined to be the spark that ignited it. But as he turned onto Pine Street, he noticed a disturbance at the far corner. A crowd had gathered, their murmurs rising like a storm. Curious, Terrence quickened his pace. His instincts told him something was wrong. In the center of the commotion stood a young man, barely out of his teens, with his hands raised in surrender. Facing him was a police officer, his posture aggressive, his tone even more so. The officer jabbed his finger into the boy's chest, shouting something Terrence couldn't make out. The boy flinched but said nothing, his face pale with fear. "Calm down," Terrence said firmly as he approached the officer. His voice carried authority, but it was also measured, an attempt to de-escalate the situation. The officer turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this," he barked. "This isn't your concern." Terrence didn't flinch. "It is my concern. I'm the mayor of this city, and I won't stand by while this happens." The officer's lip curled into a sneer. "Mayor? Yeah, right. Move along before you get yourself into trouble." The crowd gasped. Terrence's reputation was well known in the community, but it was clear the officer didn't recognize him. Terrence stood his ground, his gaze steady. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, "and I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." The officer's face turned red, his temper snapping like a frayed wire. Without warning, his fist shot out, connecting with Terrence's jaw in a resounding blow. The crowd erupted in shocked gasps. Terrence staggered but did not fall. He straightened, his expression calm despite the sting of pain. His dignity remained intact, even as his jaw began to swell. A voice from the crowd shouted, "That's assault." The officer didn't seem to care. He jabbed a finger into Terrence's chest. "You think you're tough. I'll show you how we handle punks like you." Before Terrence could respond, another officer rushed onto the scene. His face was pale, his movements hurried. "Stop. Stop immediately," he yelled, pulling his colleague back. "That's Mayor Jackson." The first officer froze, his mouth hanging open in stunned disbelief. The crowd murmured in shock, their eyes darting between the mayor and the offending officer. Terrence rubbed his bruised jaw, staring the officer down with an icy calm. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but cold. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your career." The crowd fell silent, their breaths held in anticipation. Terrence turned to the officer who had assaulted him. "What's your name?" he asked. "Officer Daniels," the man stammered, his bravado crumbling. "Well, Officer Daniels," Terrence said, his tone like steel, "you're going to tell me why you thought it was acceptable to assault a citizen of this city, because if this is how you treat me, I can only imagine how you treat others." Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. His partner, clearly shaken, tried to interject. "Mayor Jackson, Terrence silenced him with a raised hand. "This conversation isn't over. And let me be clear, There will be consequences. The crowd erupted into applause, their faith in their mayor solidified by his unwavering stance. Phones were out, recording every second of the confrontation. As the videos began to spread, Terrence knew that this moment would define more than just his administration. It was a battle cry for justice, for accountability, and for a city that had long been divided by fear and inequality. But Terrence also knew this was only the beginning. Change would not come easily, and there would be more battles to fight. As he walked away from the scene, his security detail now flanking him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events were a prelude to something much larger. Back at City Hall, Terrence sat in his office, replaying the encounter in his mind. His jaw throbbed, a painful reminder of the line that had been crossed. Rachel Stevens, his chief of staff, entered the room with a worried expression. "The video's already going viral," she said. "People are demanding answers. What's our next move?" Terrence leaned back in his chair, his resolve hardening. "We make a statement. We show this city that no one is above accountability, not even those who wear a badge." Rachel nodded. "And Daniels?" "He's suspended, effective immediately," Terrence said. "And I want a full review of every complaint that's been filed against him." As Rachel left to relay his orders, Terrence turned his gaze to the city skyline. The fight for justice was far from over, but he was ready. This was his city. These were his people. And he would not let them down. The ripple effects of that punch were only beginning, but Terrence Jackson stood firm, ready to face whatever came next. The ripple effect. The incident on Pine Street spread like wildfire. Within hours, video footage of Mayor Terrence Jackson being struck by a police officer was trending across social media platforms. National news picked up the story, and headlines blared with outrage. "Rookie cop punches mayor in broad daylight." "First black mayor confronts police brutality head-on," and "Justice in question after mayor attacked by police." Back at City Hall, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The phones rang incessantly, calls from reporters, community leaders, and citizens, either expressing support or demanding immediate action. In the conference room, Terrence and his team gathered around a table strewn with documents, laptops, and half-empty coffee cups. Everyone looked to him for direction. Rachel Stevens, his no-nonsense chief of staff, broke the silence. "Terrence, we have to address this now. The video has millions of views, and people are calling for Officer Daniels to be fired on the spot." Terrence rubbed his temple, the bruise on his jaw still tender. This isn't just about Daniels. This is about the culture that made him think he could get away with it. If we focus solely on him, we're treating the symptom, not the disease. Chris Miller, head of Terrence's security detail, leaned forward. "Mayor Jackson, with all due respect, this isn't just a PR crisis. It's a safety issue. That officer's actions put you at risk. We need to tighten your security and reconsider public appearances until this dies down." Terrence shook his head firmly. "Chris, I can't lead from behind closed doors. If I retreat, it sends the wrong message. The people need to see me standing strong." Rachel interjected. "Fine, but let's be smart about it. We need to hold a press conference and take control of the narrative before it spirals." "What's our message?" Terrence stood, his jaw set with determination. "Our message is simple: accountability, transparency, change. I'll condemn what happened today, but I'll also lay out a plan to reform the department. We're not just reacting. We're taking action." Rachel scribbled notes furiously. "We'll need a full media blitz to back that up. And what about Daniels? A suspension isn't going to satisfy the public." Terrence's voice hardened. "He's suspended pending a full investigation, and I want every complaint filed against him reviewed immediately. If there's a pattern, we'll expose it." The room buzzed with activity as his team began organizing the press conference. Meanwhile, Terrence retreated to his office to prepare his statement. He stared out the window at the city skyline, a mixture of anger and sadness washing over him. The punch wasn't just an attack on him. It was a symbol of everything he had been fighting against: systemic racism, abuse of power, and a culture of impunity. As evening fell, Terrence stepped onto the steps of City Hall, where a sea of reporters and cameras awaited him. Behind them, a crowd had gathered, supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for All," and "We stand with Mayor Jackson." Others held signs demanding police reform and an end to brutality. Terrence approached the podium, his security detail flanking him. The crowd hushed as he began to speak. "Today, we witnessed a moment that has shaken our city," he began, his voice steady but impassioned. "I was not just attacked as an individual. I was attacked as a representative of the values we hold dear: justice, equality, and accountability." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But let me be clear, this is not just about one officer. This is about a system that allows these actions to go unchecked. That stops now. Starting today, I am launching a comprehensive review of our police department's policies, practices, and personnel. Every complaint will be investigated. Every officer will undergo mandatory de-escalation training, and we will establish a civilian oversight board to ensure accountability." The crowd erupted into applause, but Terrence raised his hand for silence. "This is not about punishment. It's about progress. We are better than this. Our city deserves better than this. And I promise you, we will build a system that protects every citizen, no matter their race, gender, or background." As he concluded, the crowd cheered, their chants of support echoing into the night. But Terrence knew the road ahead would not be easy. The press conference was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, there were entrenched interests, political resistance, and deep-seated prejudice that would fight against change. The next morning, Terrence's inbox was flooded with emails, from citizens sharing their own experiences of injustice to officials expressing concern over his sweeping reforms. Among them was a message from an anonymous sender that caught his eye. "You think you're making a difference? You'll pay for what you're doing. Stay in your lane, Mayor." Terrence's stomach churned, but he quickly forwarded the message to Chris, who called immediately. "We're tracing the source, but I need you to take this seriously. Threats like this can't be ignored." "I'm not ignoring it," Terrence said, "but I won't be intimidated either." As the day unfolded, Terrence held meetings with community leaders, activists, and law enforcement officials. Many supported his reforms, but others, particularly within the police department, pushed back. "You're undermining our authority," argued Captain Barnes, a veteran officer with decades of service. "How can we do our jobs if we're constantly looking over our shoulders, fearing civilian oversight?" Terrence met his gaze evenly. "Captain, authority comes with accountability. If your officers are doing their jobs ethically, they have nothing to fear. This isn't about handcuffing law enforcement. It's about ensuring they don't handcuff the wrong people for the wrong reasons." The tension in the room was palpable, but Terrence held his ground. He knew this wasn't a battle that could be won overnight, but he was ready for the long fight. That evening, as Terrence walked through his neighborhood, he was stopped by an elderly woman who placed a hand on his arm. "Mr. Mayor," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I've lived in this city for 70 years. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. What you're doing gives me hope. Please don't stop fighting." Terrence smiled warmly, placing his hand over hers. "Thank you. I promise you, I won't." As he continued down the street, his resolve hardened. The events of the past 2 days had revealed the depth of the challenges he faced, but they had also reminded him of why he fought. This city was his home, and its people were his family. He would not rest until justice and equality were more than just words. They would be a reality. But as he turned the corner, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. There were forces working against him, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. What Terrence didn't know was that the fight was coming for him sooner than he thought. The storm within. Terrence Jackson woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. The clock read 6:30 a.m., and the early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of his modest bedroom. He reached for the phone, groaning slightly from the dull ache in his jaw, a painful souvenir from the confrontation with Officer Daniels. Rachel's voice crackled through the phone before he could even say hello. "Terrence, we have a situation." He sat up, his body already tense. "What now?" "There's been an online threat. It's not just vague anymore. It's targeted. They've named you directly, and it's gaining traction. We need to talk, and we need to talk now." Terrence sighed, his exhaustion momentarily overtaken by adrenaline. "I'll be there in 30. At City Hall, the atmosphere was taut with unease. Terrence entered the meeting room where Rachel, Chris, and several members of his staff were already gathered. Rachel handed him a tablet with the offending message displayed. The post was chilling in its simplicity. "The mayor thinks he's untouchable. Let's remind him who's really in charge." Beneath it was a photo of City Hall, time-stamped from the night before. Chris spoke first, his tone clipped and professional. "We've traced the post to an anonymous account, likely a burner. It's connected to a network of extremist groups that have been targeting local officials nationwide. This is more organized than we initially thought." Terrence's jaw tightened. "And what are we doing about it?" "Additional security measures are already in place," Chris said. "Your residence, City Hall, and any public venues where you might appear are under constant surveillance. But we need to consider scaling back your public appearances." "No," Terrence said firmly, his voice leaving no room for debate. "I won't hide. If I disappear now, it'll look like I'm running scared. That's exactly what they want." Rachel leaned forward. "Terrence, this isn't just about optics. This is about your safety. We've already received multiple reports of suspicious activity around City Hall. These people are escalating." Terrence met her gaze, his tone softening but not wavering. "I hear you, Rachel, but we can't let fear dictate our actions. If we back down, we lose the trust of the people who believe in us. We need to keep moving forward." The room fell silent for a moment before Rachel spoke again. "If you're determined to stay visible, then we need to get ahead of this. Let's use this moment to double down on your message of accountability and reform. Show them you're not intimidated." Terrence nodded. "Let's do it." Later that morning, Terrence held a virtual town hall from a secure location. His face was calm but resolute as he addressed the camera, knowing that thousands of eyes were watching. "Last week, I stood before you and promised accountability," he began. "I promised to address the deep-seated issues in our city's law enforcement. Today, I reaffirm that promise. No amount of threats or intimidation will deter me from serving the people of this city. We will move forward together." The chat feature on the platform buzzed with activity. Messages of support and gratitude flooded in. But there were also dissenting voices, questioning his ability to lead or calling for more immediate action. Terrence addressed those concerns head-on. "To those who doubt our progress, I say this: real change takes time. It takes commitment. And it takes all of us working together. This is not about any one person or group. It's about creating a city where every citizen feels safe, respected, and valued." The town hall ended on a hopeful note, but Terrence knew the real challenges lay ahead. As he logged off, Rachel entered the room, her expression grave. "We've received another tip," she said. "It's about the group behind the threats. They're planning something big, and it's tied to one of the community centers you've been working with." Terrence felt a chill run through him. The community centers had become a cornerstone of his administration, safe spaces where residents could access resources, build connections, and engage in civic life. Targeting them was not just an attack on his policies, it was an attack on the very fabric of the city. "Which center?" he asked. Rachel hesitated. "We don't know yet. The intelligence is vague, but they're calling it the Reckoning. It's set to happen within the next 24 hours. The command center at City Hall was abuzz with activity as law enforcement, city officials, and Terrence's team worked around the clock to piece together the threat. Maps of the city's community centers were spread across the tables, and officers relayed updates over radios. Chris approached Terrence, his expression grim. "We've narrowed it down to 3 potential targets: Lincoln Center, Unity Hall, and the Martin Luther King Community Center. Each one has events scheduled tomorrow, and each one would draw a significant crowd." Terrence's mind raced. "We need to evacuate them preemptively and tighten security. If we treat this as credible and nothing happens, fine. But if we ignore it and they strike—" Chris nodded. "Understood. I'll coordinate with local law enforcement to secure the sites, but we should also consider canceling the events." "No," Terrence said, shaking his head. "Canceling would signal defeat. These centers represent hope for our communities. We need to show that hope is stronger than fear. Strengthen security, yes, but the events go on." Rachel looked unconvinced. "You're playing a dangerous game, Terrence." "It's not a game," he replied. "It's a fight for the soul of this city." By evening, the plan was in motion. Security teams were deployed to all 3 centers, and undercover officers mingled with staff and visitors to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Terrence visited each center personally, offering words of encouragement to the staff and volunteers who were visibly nervous but determined to proceed. At the Martin Luther King Community Center, he met a group of young volunteers setting up for a youth outreach event. One of them, a teenage girl named Nina, approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Mayor," she said, "are you sure it's safe to do this? My mom didn't even want me to come." Terrence knelt to her level, his voice gentle but firm. "Nina, it's okay to be scared, but bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're afraid. You're making a difference by being here, and that takes real courage." Nina nodded, a small smile breaking through her worried expression. "Thank you." As he left the center, Terrence couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something that would test the city and his leadership in ways he couldn't yet imagine. For now, all he could do was prepare for the storm and hope the city was strong enough to weather it. The edge of chaos. The next morning dawned heavy with tension. The city's streets seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath in anticipation. At City Hall, the command center buzzed with urgency, a stark contrast to the eerie calm outside. Every screen displayed real-time feeds from the 3 community centers identified as potential targets: Lincoln Center, Unity Hall, and the Martin Luther King Community Center. Terrence Jackson, seated at the head of the room, listened intently as Chris briefed the team. "We've bolstered security at all 3 sites. Bomb squads are stationed nearby, and undercover officers are already in place. Surveillance drones are monitoring the perimeters, and evacuation plans are ready if needed." Terrence nodded. "And the public? How are we handling concerns?" Rachel, who had been juggling calls and media inquiries since dawn, spoke up. "We've released a statement reassuring residents that we're taking every precaution. But people are nervous. Attendance at the community centers is already down by 30%. That's still too many lives at risk," Terrence said, leaning forward. "We can't let anything happen to them." Chris's voice was firm. "We'll do everything we can, Mr. Mayor, but these people are well organized and determined. If they're planning something, they'll find a way to make an impact." Terrence's jaw tightened. "Then we find them first." At the Lincoln Community Center, families began gathering for a mid-morning health fair. Children played in the designated activity zones, while parents browsed booths offering free medical checkups and resources. The air was filled with the hum of conversation, laughter, and the occasional shriek of delight from kids chasing balloons. But beneath the surface, the atmosphere was tense. Security personnel, dressed inconspicuously, kept watch from the edges of the event. A pair of officers walked through the crowd, their eyes scanning for anything, or anyone, out of place. Inside the main building, the director of the center, an older woman named Mrs. Porter, greeted Terrence as he arrived to inspect the preparations. "Mr. Mayor," she said, her voice warm but tinged with worry, I appreciate you coming, but are you sure it's safe? You're putting yourself at risk. Terrence smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. If I'm asking the community to stand strong, then I have to do the same. How's everything here? So far, so good, she replied. But we're all on edge. Stay vigilant, Terrence said. We're not taking any chances. As he made his way through the event, he stopped to talk to families, shaking hands and offering words of encouragement. His presence, while calming for many, was also a beacon, reminding everyone why they were there. At Unity Hall, the mood was different. This center was hosting a job fair, and the crowd was more subdued, focused on finding opportunities rather than celebrating. The security presence was just as strong, but the event had drawn fewer attendees, likely due to the growing unease in the city. Terrence arrived just as a group of young men was leaving, their faces lit with cautious optimism after securing interviews. He stopped them, shaking hands and congratulating them on their progress. Don't let fear hold you back, he told them. This city needs people like you to keep moving forward. One of the young men, a recent college graduate named Andra, hesitated before speaking. Mr. Mayor, do you really think things will change? I mean, with everything happening. Sometimes it feels like it's just talk. Terrence looked him in the eye. Change is hard, Andra. It's slow, and it takes time. But every step forward, no matter how small, is progress. Don't give up on that. Andra nodded, a flicker of hope in his expression. Thank you, sir. By the time Terrence arrived at the Martin Luther King Community Center, the sun was high in the sky. This center, hosting the youth outreach event, was the most vibrant of the three. Children painted murals on large canvases while volunteers handed out snacks and drinks. Despite the cheerful activity, the weight of the morning's tension hung heavy. Terrence was greeted by Nina, the teenage volunteer he had spoken to the day before. She ran up to him, holding a colorful flyer advertising the day's events. Mr. Mayor, look, she said, her voice bright with pride. We made this for the event. He smiled, taking the flyer and studying it. You did a fantastic job, Nina. This is exactly what we need. Something that shows what this city can become. Her smile faltered slightly. Do you think we're safe here? Terrence crouched slightly to meet her eye level. I do. But more importantly, we're showing that we won't let fear win. That's the most powerful thing we can do. As the morning turned to afternoon, Terrence monitored updates from all three sites while remaining at the Martin Luther King Center. Chris's voice came through his earpiece periodically, providing updates on crowd sizes, security measures, and suspicious activity, or lack thereof. Then, just after noon, a call came in. Suspicious vehicle spotted outside the Lincoln Center, an officer reported. No plates. Bomb squad is en route. Terrence's heart sank. He quickly relayed orders. Evacuate the center immediately. Move everyone to a safe distance. Chris's voice came through next. Understood. Teams are responding. As Terrence issued commands, another report came in. This time, it was from Unity Hall. We've got an unresponsive individual in the parking lot, possible decoy or victim. Proceeding with caution. Rachel, standing nearby, looked at Terrence with wide eyes. They're splitting our focus. Terrence nodded grimly. Exactly. They want to spread us thin. Stay on top of both situations. But even as they worked to address the threats at Lincoln and Unity, the true danger revealed itself. At the Martin Luther King Community Center, everything seemed normal. Until it wasn't. A man, dressed as a delivery driver, entered the building carrying a large box. He moved toward the auditorium where a group of teenagers was gathered for a workshop. One of the undercover officers stationed inside noticed him and approached. Can I help you? The man hesitated, his hand hovering near his pocket. Just a delivery, he muttered. The officer's instincts kicked in. Hold on. Let me see some ID. The man's demeanor shifted. He dropped the box and bolted toward the exit. The officer shouted, Stop. and gave chase, but the man was quick, disappearing into the crowd outside. The dropped box was immediately secured, and the building was evacuated. As officers examined its contents, Terrence received the call he had been dreading. "Mr. Mayor," Chris said, his voice tight with urgency. The box contained a crude explosive device. It was rigged to detonate remotely. If that officer hadn't intervened. Terrence closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. "Is everyone safe?" "Everyone's out," Chris confirmed. "No injuries, but this isn't over. The man who planted it is still out there." As the events unfolded, Terrence addressed the city from the steps of the Martin Luther King Center, his voice resolute despite the turmoil. "To those who seek to divide us, let me be clear. You will not win. This city is stronger than your hate. We will find you, and we will bring you to justice. But more importantly, we will continue to build a community where every person feels safe and valued." The crowd cheered, but Terrence knew the battle was far from over. The city had been shaken, but it had not been broken. And as long as he stood at its helm, he would ensure it never would be. The reckoning unveiled. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. Terrence Jackson sat in the command center at City Hall, his jaw set and his mind racing. The events of the day had taken their toll. False alarms, targeted threats, and the discovery of a live explosive device at the Martin Luther King Community Center had left him and his team drained. Yet the man responsible for the chaos and his network of conspirators remained at large. Chris entered the room, his face grim. "We've identified the suspect who planted the device at the community center. Surveillance footage shows him fleeing into an industrial area near the river. It's a known hotspot for extremist activity." Terrence stood, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Do we have confirmation it's connected to the threats?" Chris nodded. "Absolutely. The same network we've been monitoring. This was coordinated. We've also uncovered chatter about their next move. It's bigger, and it's set for tonight." Rachel, seated at a nearby desk, looked up sharply. "What's the target?" Chris hesitated. "They're planning simultaneous attacks at multiple locations. One of them is City Hall." The room fell silent. Terrence's mind immediately went to the people working late in the building, unaware of the imminent danger. "Evacuate the building," he ordered. "Get everyone out now." Rachel jumped into action, issuing commands over the radio. Chris stepped closer to Terrence. "We need to get you out of here too. You're their ultimate target." Terrence shook his head. "Not yet. If they're planning something bigger, we need to know where and when. I'm not leaving until we have answers." Chris frowned, but didn't argue. "Then we tighten security. No one gets in or out without clearance." Meanwhile, at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the man known as Jacob Trent paced the dimly lit space. Around him, a group of followers, masked and armed, prepared for the night's activities. Blueprints of City Hall and other key locations were spread across a table, illuminated by a flickering overhead light. Trent's voice was cold and deliberate as he addressed the group. "Tonight, we remind this city who really holds the power. Jackson thinks he can tear down what we've built. He's wrong. This city belongs to us." A younger man, visibly nervous, raised his hand. "What if they're ready for us? The police have been tightening security everywhere." Trent slammed his hand on the table, silencing him. "They won't be ready for what's coming. We've planned this for months. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." Back at City Hall, the evacuation was nearly complete. Terrence stood in his office, gazing out the window at the city skyline. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he refused to give in to fear. He turned as Rachel entered, her expression urgent. "Terrence, we just intercepted a communication. They're not just targeting City Hall. They're planning to attack one of the hospitals as a diversion." Terrence's eyes widened. "Which hospital?" "St. Mary's," Rachel said. "It's the largest trauma center in the city. If they attack there, it could be catastrophic. Terrence's mind raced. Get law enforcement and emergency responders to Street Marys immediately. I want that hospital locked down. And make sure they coordinate with the hospital staff to ensure patient safety. Rachel nodded and left to relay the orders. Terrence turned to Chris, who had been standing silently by the door. This is escalating faster than we anticipated. What's our best move? Chris hesitated. We need to shut them down at the source. If Trent is leading this operation, taking him out of the equation could dismantle the whole plan. Do we know where he is? Terrence asked. Chris nodded. We've narrowed it down to a warehouse in the industrial district. SWAT is already assembling, but we need your authorization to move in. Terrence didn't hesitate. Do it, but make sure they're prepared. This group is dangerous. At the warehouse, Trent's group was making final preparations when they heard the distant sound of sirens. Trent's face darkened as he barked orders. They found us. Everyone, stick to the plan. We're not backing down. The group scattered, some grabbing weapons while others began packing up equipment. Trent remained calm, his eyes fixed on the blueprints. He reached for a detonator hidden beneath the table, a twisted smile forming on his lips. If they think they can stop us, they're in for a surprise. As SWAT teams converged on the warehouse, Terrence remained in the command center, monitoring the operation. The tension in the room was palpable as live drone feeds displayed the unfolding scene. They're fortified, Chris reported. This won't be easy. Terrence's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It's not over. We're closer than you think. Attached was a photo of City Hall, taken from what appeared to be inside the building. His heart sank. Chris, we've got a breach. Chris immediately relayed the information to his team, and additional officers began sweeping the building. Terrence's mind raced. If Trent's group had infiltrated City Hall, it meant the threat was closer than he'd realized. At the warehouse, the SWAT team made their move. Flashbangs erupted, disorienting Trent's group as officers stormed the building. Gunfire echoed through the space as the extremists resisted, but the tactical advantage was clear. Within minutes, most of the group had been subdued. Trent, however, was nowhere to be found. Chris's voice came through the command center radio. We've secured the warehouse, but Trent escaped. He's still out there. Terrence's stomach tightened. And City Hall. Clear so far, Chris said, but we're still searching. As the night deepened, the city braced for the next move. Terrence refused to leave the command center, his resolve unwavering. He knew the fight wasn't over. Trent was still at large, and the network he had built posed a threat that wouldn't disappear overnight. For now, the city had been spared the worst, but Terrence understood that the battle for its soul was just beginning. He glanced at the map of the city displayed on the wall, his thoughts heavy with determination. Whatever it takes, he murmured to himself. We'll make this right. The weight of the night pressed on, but so did the promise of a better future, a future Terrence was determined to fight for, no matter the cost. Closing the net, the air in the command center was thick with tension. Terrence Jackson leaned against the table, staring at the live feeds of City Hall and the now-raided warehouse. Trent's escape felt like a personal affront, a taunt that he was still out there, plotting his next move. Chris paced the room, his phone pressed to his ear. We're sweeping the city. Roadblocks are up, and teams are checking every known associate of Trent. If he's still in the city, we'll find him. Rachel joined Terrence, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. You need to stay sharp. This isn't over. Terrence nodded, gripping the cup but not drinking. It's not just about Trent. This group was organized. They'd been planning this for months. Even if we catch him, there's no guarantee the attacks stop. Rachel hesitated, then placed a folder in front of him. We've been analyzing their chatter. There's a second layer to their plan. A coordinated effort to incite chaos by targeting public trust. Misinformation, cyber attacks, anything to destabilize your administration. Terrence opened the folder, scanning the details. Fake social media accounts spreading false narratives about him, claims of corruption, even doctored images suggesting he was involved in criminal activity. It was a calculated smear campaign. "Trent's not just a terrorist," Terrence said grimly. "He's a propagandist. If we don't stop this now, it won't just be my administration they undermine. It'll be the entire city's trust in leadership." Chris returned, his expression troubled. "We've got a lead." A vehicle matching Trent's description was spotted heading toward the old railway station near the industrial district. "It's a perfect hideout. Abandoned, lots of exits, easy to defend." Terrence straightened. "Then that's where we end this." At the railway station, Trent paced the dusty floor of an abandoned office, his frustration boiling over. The escape from the warehouse had cost him more than he expected. Several of his key operatives were captured, and much of their equipment was left behind. One of his remaining followers, a young man named Drew, hesitated before speaking. "Trent, maybe we should pull back. Regroup. The cops are all over us." Trent's glare was ice cold. "No. We've come too far to back down now. Jackson needs to see that he's not untouchable. The people need to see it." He pulled a laptop from a bag, its screen glowing in the dim light. "If they want to play games, we'll hit them where it hurts." In the command center, Rachel's phone buzzed with an alert. She glanced at it and froze. "We've got a breach." Terrence looked up sharply. "What kind of breach?" Rachel's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up a live feed. City Hall's internal systems, emails, files, schedules, they're being accessed remotely. "It's Trent. He's trying to weaponize our own information against us." Terrence clenched his fists. "Can we shut him out?" "Working on it," Rachel said, sweat beading on her brow. "But he's good. This isn't amateur work." Chris was already moving. "If he's using a secure connection, it's likely coming from that railway station. We got tactical teams in the area. I'll alert them." Terrence's voice was firm. "I'm going with you." Chris turned, ready to argue, but Terrence held up a hand. "No discussion. This is my fight, and I need to see it through." Rachel sighed. "Then you're going with full security detail. No risks." The convoy arrived at the railway station under the cover of darkness. Tactical units surrounded the building, their movements silent and precise. Terrence stayed back, flanked by Chris and two armed guards, as the officers made their approach. Inside, Trent was still hunched over the laptop, oblivious to the advancing team. He smirked as he typed, uploading files he'd stolen from City Hall, a mix of sensitive emails and doctored documents designed to sow distrust and chaos. "This will do the trick," he muttered, his voice laced with venom. "By morning, the city will turn on Jackson." The door burst open with a deafening crash, flashbangs illuminating the room. Trent was thrown back from his chair, disoriented but furious. He reached for a weapon concealed under the desk, but an officer was faster, pinning him to the ground. "It's over, Trent," Chris said, stepping into the room. "You've lost." Terrence followed, his presence commanding. He locked eyes with Trent, who glared up at him, defiant even in defeat. "You think this changes anything?" Trent spat. "The city's broken, Jackson. You can't fix it. People like me will always exist." Terrence's voice was calm, but his words were sharp. "People like you thrive on fear and hate, but this city is stronger than you think. We'll rebuild trust, brick by brick, no matter how hard you try to tear it down." As Trent was led away, Terrence surveyed the room. The equipment, the files, the hateful messages scrawled on walls. It was a grim reminder of the battle ahead. This was just one fight in a much larger war. Back at City Hall, the mood was a mix of relief and determination. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the damage left behind required urgent attention. Terrence addressed his team, his voice steady. "We stopped them tonight, but the work doesn't end here. We need to repair what they tried to break. Our systems, our trust, and our unity." Rachel nodded. The misinformation they spread is already circulating. We'll need a strong public response. Then we give them the truth, Terrence said. We show them what real leadership looks like. That evening, Terrence held a live press conference, standing on the steps of City Hall. The city watched as he spoke, his words carrying the weight of the past days. Tonight, we stopped a threat that sought to divide and destroy. But the real victory isn't in what we stopped. It's in what we'll build together. Hate has no home here. Fear has no power here. This is our city, and we'll move forward united. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the night. Terrence stepped back from the podium, his resolve stronger than ever. The storm had passed, but the fight for justice, unity, and hope continued. And he would be ready. A new dawn, a hard-fought hope. The following morning, the city of Crestview awoke to a fragile peace. News of Jacob Trent's capture had spread, and for the first time in days, there was a sense of relief. Yet, as Terrence Jackson looked out over the city from his office, he knew the battle was far from over. The wounds Trent and his group had tried to inflict ran deeper than the physical threats. They had aimed to break the city's spirit, to undermine its trust in leadership, and to ignite division. Terrence turned away from the window as Rachel entered, carrying a stack of reports. Her expression was a mix of weariness and determination. "The fallout's massive," she said, placing the reports on his desk. "Social media is flooded with posts about the attacks. The good news is the truth about Trent's group is coming out. People are starting to see through the misinformation. But we've got work to do." Terrence nodded, taking a deep breath. "What's the status on the community centers?" Rachel pulled out a separate file. "All 3 are fully secured. Attendance is still lower than usual, but the staff and volunteers are pushing forward. They're determined to keep the doors open." Terrence allowed himself a small smile. "Good. They're showing this city that we don't back down. That's the first step." Later that morning, Terrence visited the Martin Luther King Community Center, the site of the closest call during Trent's campaign of terror. The once bustling center was quieter now, with only a handful of families and volunteers present. Yet, the energy of resilience was palpable. Nana, the teenage volunteer who had stood so bravely the day before, ran up to him with a wide grin. "Mr. Mayor, you're back." Terrence smiled, crouching slightly to meet her at eye level. "Of course, Nana. I wouldn't miss it. How's everything going here?" "We're good," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Everyone's talking about what you did. You kept us safe." Terrence placed a hand on her shoulder. "You all kept yourselves safe, too. Standing strong, refusing to give in to fear. That's what makes this city special." As he spoke, the center's director, Mrs. Porter, approached with a clipboard. Her eyes were tired but kind. "Mr. Mayor, I can't thank you enough for being here. The community needed to see you, especially after everything." Terrence nodded, taking the clipboard from her and scanning the day's agenda. "We've got a lot to rebuild, Mrs. Porter, but we'll do it together, one step at a time." At City Hall, the atmosphere was equally charged. Chris had called a special meeting to discuss the ongoing investigation into Trent's group. As Terrence entered the room, he was met with the familiar buzz of law enforcement, cybersecurity experts, and city officials working in tandem. Chris began the briefing, his tone serious. "We've identified several more individuals connected to Trent's network. They were working on amplifying misinformation and organizing smaller-scale attacks. We've already issued warrants for their arrests." Rachel chimed in. "But the real challenge is undoing the damage they've done online. Their false narratives are still circulating, and while most people are seeing through it, some are buying into the lies." Terrence leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "We need a counter-narrative, something that cuts through the noise and reminds people what this city stands for." Rachel nodded. "We've already started drafting a campaign. It's focused on unity, resilience, and transparency. We'll involve community leaders, educators, and even local artists." Terrence smiled. "Good. Let's make it loud and undeniable. This city deserves the truth. As the day wore on, Terence met with leaders from various communities across the city. From clergy members to youth advocates, each brought stories of fear, resilience, and hope. Many shared their gratitude for his leadership, while others expressed concerns about how to prevent such incidents in the future. One particularly poignant meeting was with the mother of Jamal, the teenager who had been at the center of the initial altercation with Officer Daniels. She clasped Terence's hand tightly, her eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Mayor, you saved my boy," she said. "You stood up for him when no one else would. I can't thank you enough." Terence shook his head gently. "It's not just about Jamal. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what he did. That's the promise I made to this city, and I intend to keep it." By evening, the city gathered for a vigil on the steps of City Hall. Candles flickered in the twilight as residents from all walks of life came together to honor the resilience of their community and the leadership that had guided them through the storm. Terence stood at the podium, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "Tonight, we light these candles not just to remember the trials we faced, but to celebrate the strength we've shown. This city has been tested, but we have not broken. We've stood together, and that unity is what will carry us forward." The crowd erupted into applause, and as Terence stepped back from the podium, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in days. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he truly believed they were moving in the right direction. Later that night, as Terence sat in his quiet home, his phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. It was a link to a video, a montage of moments from the past few days, highlighting the courage of the city's residents, the dedication of its leaders, and the hope that had emerged from the chaos. The final frame was a simple message: "This is our city. Together, we rise." Terence smiled, setting the phone down and leaning back in his chair. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to exhale. The city was battered but not broken, and as long as he had a voice, he would continue to fight for its future. The new dawn brought challenges, but it also brought hope. And for Terence Jackson, hope was more powerful than any punch, threat, or storm. It was the foundation upon which he would rebuild.